The fire started in a bakery. This is one of the most famous facts in English history, and it is also, when you think about it carefully, one of the most ordinary. Fires in 17th century London started in bakeries the way they started in every other type of shop and household and workshop in a city built of wood. They started where fires were, and where fires were not adequately managed. They started because someone was tired, or careless, or simply because fire is a fundamentally difficult thing to contain in a wooden city of 400,000 people, with no professional fire service. The bakery on Pudding Lane was owned by Thomas Fariner. He was a bread baker, a king's baker in fact, which meant he supplied bread to the Royal Navy, which meant his operation was larger than a typical neighborhood bakery, which meant his ovens ran hotter and longer. On the night of September 1st, 1666, or more precisely in the very early hours of September 2nd, before dawn, something in Thomas Fariner's bakery failed to be adequately managed. His maid noticed it first. She woke to smoke. She called out. The family escaped through an upper window onto a neighbor's roof. One servant, apparently, did not make it out. And the fire, left unattended, found the dry timber of the house and the dry timber of the next house, and the dry timber of the city of London that had been drying for 13 weeks of the hottest, driest summer anyone could remember. It found the city. And then it ran. Welcome to Dull Tales. Tonight we're going to London in 1666, not to Samuel Pepys's famous diary account, though we'll spend some time with him because his account is too good to skip entirely. We're going to the people on the ground. The baker who started it. The merchant who watched it from the river. The woman who buried her best cheese in the garden before she fled. The firefighter who pulled down houses with a hook on a pole, because that was the technology available. And the thousands of ordinary Londoners who spent 4 days watching their city burn, and then had to figure out what came next. Before we go in, subscribe if Dull Tales is your late-night company. Leave a comment, tell me if you've been to the monument in London, the column built to mark where the fire started. Tell me what you thought of it. Let me ask you a few things. Why did the fire spread so quickly, when London had survived other fires? What was specific about 1666 that made the conditions so uniquely terrible? What did the actual firefighting effort look like? What tools did they have? What decisions did they make? And which decisions made things worse rather than better? Who was in charge? Who made the decisions about which areas to protect and which to sacrifice? And was the king involved? What happened to the people who lost their homes? And most of them did. 87 churches and 13,000 houses burned in the days and weeks after. And the question that connects the past to the present: what does it actually feel like to watch a city burn? What is the specific human experience of watching the place you live be consumed, while you stand unable to do anything about it? Tonight we find out. Congratulations! You've just woken up in London in the early hours of September 2nd, 1666. The summer has been brutally hot and dry. The city is asleep. On Pudding Lane, something is wrong. Let's go in. Let me start with the city itself. Because to understand why the Great Fire burned the way it did, you have to understand what London was in 1666. London in 1666 was a city of approximately 400,000 people, the largest city in England by a very significant margin, the commercial and political center of the country, the port through which the commerce of a growing overseas empire moved. It was also almost entirely made of wood. Not entirely. There were stone buildings, the great churches and some of the wealthier private houses. But the vast majority of the city's housing stock and its commercial buildings were timber-framed construction, the specific medieval building technology of wooden structural frames filled with wattle and daub or brick, with wooden upper floors often projecting out over the street below. The streets were narrow. The buildings were close together. The buildings overhung the streets, the upper floors projecting further out than the lower ones, so that on the narrower streets, the upper floors of the buildings on opposite sides of the street were close enough to almost touch. This is not an architectural description only. This is a fire safety description. Narrow streets, close buildings, wooden construction, buildings so close overhead that fire could leap from one roof to the next without touching the ground. And in the summer of 1666, 13 weeks without rain. The specific drought that had preceded the fire was documented by observers who noted the state of the vegetation, the reduced water levels in the wells, the exceptional dryness of the city's timber. Wood absorbs moisture from the air when it is humid and releases moisture when it is dry. After 13 weeks of exceptional dryness, the timber of London's buildings had been desiccated to a condition that made it far more ignitable than usual. London in September 1666 was a tinderbox, an actual physical tinderbox, and Thomas Farriner's bakery was the spark. Let me give you the first hours. The fire started in the small hours of September 2nd. By the time it was visible from the street, visible beyond the initial burning of Farriner's bakery, it had already spread to several neighboring buildings. The narrow street, the overhanging upper floors, the exceptional dryness of the timber, the fire moved faster than fires normally moved. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken by a messenger some time before dawn. He came to see the fire. He looked at it. He is reported to have said, in what would become one of the most ill-judged assessments in English civic history, "A woman might piss it out." He went back to bed. This was, by the standards of firefighting decisions made in the Great Fire of London, not the worst decision made that night. But it was the first, and it established a pattern, the specific pattern of authority figures failing to grasp the scale and the speed of what was happening, that would characterize the first critical hours. The tools available for firefighting in 17th-century London were limited, but not nothing. The primary tool was the fire hook, a long pole with a metal hook at the end, used to pull down burning buildings ahead of the fire, creating fire breaks by demolishing the buildings before the fire could reach them. This worked. When the fire hooks were used decisively and early enough, they worked. The fire break created by pulling down a row of buildings deprived the fire of fuel and stopped its spread. But pulling down buildings required the consent of their owners, the authority of the civic officials to order demolition, and the specific organized effort of enough men with hooks and ropes working together. The first hours of the fire were hours in which these things were not sufficiently organized. By dawn on September 2nd, the fire had been burning for several hours. It was well beyond the capacity of a woman to extinguish. Let me give you Thomas Farriner. Because Thomas Farriner's story does not end with the fire that started in his bakery. He survived the fire. He escaped through the upper window, as we noted. He lost his bakery, which was consumed in the first hour, but he survived. He was also the subject of specific suspicion and accusation in the years that followed. The Great Fire of London was, almost immediately, the subject of conspiracy theories. London in 1666 was a city already anxious about foreign threats. England was at war with the Dutch, and there was specific anxiety about French and Catholic plots. The fire, which by any reasonable assessment was an accident, was widely believed in the immediate aftermath to be arson. Farriner himself was suspected initially. The man whose bakery started the fire was a natural focus of suspicion. He denied it. In the subsequent inquiry, the parliamentary investigation that examined the fire's origins and causes, Farriner was a primary witness. He testified that he had personally checked his ovens before going to bed, that the ovens had been properly damped, that he could not account for how the fire started except by suggesting that it had not started in his bakery at all. The inquiry found the fire's cause to be accidental. The monument erected at the site of the fire's start, the monument, the 202-foot column whose height equals the distance from its base to the site of Farriner's bakery, originally bore an inscription attributing the fire to the treachery and malice of the Popish faction. The inscription was removed in 1831. Farriner maintained his denial until his death in 1670. His bakery was rebuilt. His bread continued to supply the Navy. Whether the fire actually started in the bakery in the way that the traditional account describes, whether an insufficiently damped oven or a carelessly handled ember was the specific proximate cause, is something that cannot be definitively established 400 years later. What is established is, the fire started near or in his bakery. It started in a dry wooden city. It spread. Let me now give you Samuel Pepys. Because Pepys's diary account of the Great Fire is one of the most vivid first-hand accounts of a historical disaster in the English language, and it gives us the specific sensory and emotional texture of the fire's first days in a way that no other source matches. Samuel Pepys was 33 years old in September 1666. He was a senior naval administrator, the clerk of the A.C.T.S. to the Navy Board, whose work kept him in close contact with the court and with the administrative apparatus of the government. He lived in the Navy office in Seething Lane, which was close enough to the fire's origin that he was directly affected by its progress, but far enough that he survived the first critical hours as an observer rather than a victim. He was woken by his maid Jane at 3 in the morning on September 2nd. She told him there was a great fire. He got up, looked out the window, and decided it was far enough away that he could go back to sleep. He got up again at 7. The fire was much larger. He went out to observe. What he observed, and what he recorded in the specific detail of a meticulous diarist who was both emotionally engaged and analytically attentive, was the specific sensory reality of a city on fire. The pigeons refusing to leave the houses and burning because they wouldn't fly away. The people with what goods they could carry, household possessions piled in the streets, in boats on the river, on carts heading out of the city. The river crowded with vessels laden with the goods of London citizens, the heat visible from a distance, the specific sound of the fire. Pepys also went to see the king. Charles II had been awake since before dawn, informed of the fire's progress by messengers. By the time Pepys arrived, the king was aware that the Lord Mayor's response had been inadequate and was prepared to authorize more decisive action. He authorized the demolition of buildings. Royal authority to pull down buildings removed the specific legal impediment, the property rights of owners who did not want their buildings demolished even to create a fire break that had slowed the early response. With royal authorization, the fire hooks went to work. But by this point, the fire had been burning for approximately 10 hours. The fire breaks that could have stopped it in the first 3 hours were now inadequate to the scale of what the fire had become. Let me tell you about the wind. Because the wind in the Great Fire of London was not background weather, it was a primary actor. London in September 1666 had a specific wind pattern that contributed decisively to the fire's spread and direction. The wind was from the east and northeast, a dry, warm wind coming from the direction of the continent, consistent with the exceptional weather pattern that had produced the summer drought. The fire started on Pudding Lane, which was east of the city center. The wind was pushing the fire west. The fire moved west through the city at the rate of the wind's speed, jumping from building to building, finding the narrow streets and the overhanging upper floors, and the dry timber that the drought had prepared. The specific geographic consequence, The fire moved toward the city of London's commercial and civic heart. It moved toward the Guildhall, toward the Royal Exchange, toward the great churches. It moved toward St. Paul's Cathedral. The wind was also an impediment to the firefighting effort in a specific way. The embers that the fire produced, the specific burning material lifted by the updraft of a large fire, were carried by the wind ahead of the fire itself, landing on rooftops and igniting new fires ahead of the main front. The fire was jumping, not just spreading along the street, jumping across gaps, starting new fires in buildings that the main front had not yet reached, creating a spreading front that was difficult to contain because it was not advancing as a single line, but as a series of overlapping and branching fronts. The wind was the fire's specific partner. Without the east wind, the fire might have been contained in the first hours. With the east wind, the fire moved west through the city for 4 days. Let me give you a merchant. His name was John Langton. He was 42 years old, a cloth merchant whose warehouse was in the area around Cannon Street, approximately 3/4 of a mile west of Pudding Lane. He was aware of the fire by dawn on September 2nd, the light visible in the east, the smoke already present, the specific anxious reports of neighbors who had come in from the streets with news. He made the calculation that merchants make in emergencies. What can be saved? The warehouse contained a significant inventory of cloth, the stock of a successful trading business, representing months of capital. He organized his workers. They began moving the cloth. The specific process of moving a warehouse's inventory in an emergency was manual labor of considerable intensity. The cloth had to be loaded onto carts or carried to boats on the river or moved to a storage location that was not in the fire's path. He worked his workers through the morning of September 2nd. The fire was moving west. His warehouse was in the fire's path. He made the decision that the warehouse could not be saved. He had moved perhaps 1/3 of the inventory. He left. He took what had been moved to a cousin's house in a neighborhood north of the city that the fire had not reached. He watched from the north as the fire consumed his warehouse. He did not cry, according to the brief account of his experience that survives in a letter to a business associate. He watched. He calculated. He began, even as he watched, to think about what came next. This is the specific quality of the merchant class's response to catastrophe that the fire's records show. The calculation, the forward orientation, the specific turn from loss to reconstruction that characterized the commercial mind. He had lost the warehouse. He had 1/3 of his inventory. He had the business relationships, the knowledge of the trade, the specific commercial skills that the warehouse had been built on. He began writing letters. Let me give you the woman with the cheese. Her name does not appear in the records, but the account survives in the diary of Samuel Pepys, who saw it and recorded it, of a woman in the area near the Navy office burying her goods in a garden as the fire approached. The specific image Pepys records, a woman burying her plate, her silverware, and notably a specific quantity of Parmesan cheese in a pit dug in her garden. The Parmesan was apparently her most valuable food item. She buried it. The fire's advance was such that she then had to flee before she could unbury it. The Parmesan in the ground. The fire overhead. She survived. She was seen later, returning to the area to dig up what she had buried. She retrieved the Parmesan. She retrieved the plate. Both survived. This is the specific comedy and pathos of the Great Fire's individual stories. The woman who valued her Parmesan enough to bury it in her garden while her city burned. The people who grabbed the oddest things, the things that were most precious to them in the specific accounting of a mind making rapid decisions about what to save and what to leave. A man who saved his violin and left the furniture. a woman who carried her birdcage and left the silver. The specific hierarchy of values that emergency reveals. Let me give you the firefighting effort in more detail. Because the firefighting effort was not absent, it was insufficient, and it was badly organized in the critical early hours, but it was real, and it involved real people making real decisions under extraordinary pressure. The primary method, as noted, was the fire hook. Organized teams of men with long poles and hooks pulled down buildings ahead of the fire's advance, creating fire breaks. The demolition of buildings was accompanied by the removal of the rubble, teams carrying the smashed timber and plaster away from the fire break to prevent the demolished material from itself becoming fuel. Water was also used, the leather buckets and the hand-operated pumps that were the fire engine technology of the period. The specific hand pumps were not capable of projecting water to the upper floors of burning buildings. They were useful for suppressing fires in the early stage, for cooling adjacent buildings, for managing the edges of the fire. They were not capable of fighting the fire's main front. The king and his brother James, Duke of York, were present at the firefighting effort. This was not simply ceremonial. Charles II was physically present at multiple fire breaks during the 4 days of the fire, coordinating the demolition effort, personally handing out money to the workers, the payment that motivated men to do the dangerous work of pulling down buildings adjacent to the fire. He was on horseback, riding through the smoke, directing the effort with the specific authority of a king whose presence galvanized the action that the Lord Mayor had failed to organize. This was, by the accounts of the observers, genuinely effective. The fire breaks that eventually stopped the fire were created by the organized demolition effort that the king's personal involvement helped organize. The fire was stopped, not extinguished but stopped from spreading further on September 5th, 4 days after it started, by which point it had burned approximately 373 acres of the city, destroyed 13,200 houses, 87 churches, and most of the buildings of the City of London's commercial and civic heart, including St. Paul's Cathedral, including the Royal Exchange, including the Guildhall. The fire was stopped. The city was mostly ash. Let me give you the experience of watching St. Paul's burn. Because St. Paul's Cathedral was the most significant building in London, one of the most significant buildings in England, and its burning was the specific moment in the Great Fire that the eyewitnesses identified as the worst thing they saw. The medieval Cathedral of St. Paul's, not the dome designed by Wren that replaced it, but the older building, the Gothic cathedral that had stood on Ludgate Hill since the medieval period, was thought by many Londoners to be fireproof. Stone buildings, by the logic of the period, did not burn. Stone was not wood. The stone of St. Paul's did not burn, but it did not have to. The wooden roof of St. Paul's, the enormous timber structure that spanned the nave, caught from the burning brands carried by the wind and from the heat of the surrounding fires. The timber roof burned. The lead of the roof melted. Eyewitnesses described the lead running like water in the streets around the cathedral. The stone walls survived, the roof burned, the interior was gutted. John Evelyn, the diarist, described watching the burning of St. Paul's with a specific quality of grief. The cathedral as the symbol of the city's religious and civic life, the specific horror of watching it destroyed. Pepys described approaching the burning cathedral and feeling the heat at a distance that communicated the scale of what was happening. The cathedral of a city is not just a building. It is the building that the city organized its identity around. Its burning was the specific devastation that went beyond the material loss of the structure to touch something in the city's sense of itself. The cathedral burned. The lead ran in the streets. The city was ending. Let me now tell you what the fire felt like from the river. Because the Thames was one of the specific vantage points from which the fire was witnessed, and it was the vantage point of tens of thousands of Londoners who had loaded their possessions onto boats and were sitting in the middle of the river watching their city burn. The Thames in September 1666 was crowded, not with the ordinary river traffic of one of the busiest commercial waterways in Europe, with the specific refugee fleet of thousands of boats, barges, wherries, and every other vessel that could float, loaded with the household goods of the people who had fled the fire and who were sheltering on the water because there was nowhere else to go. The boats were in the river. The fire was on the northern bank. From the river, you could see the fire's extent in a way that was impossible from the ground, the full front of the fire visible, the specific arc of burning that stretched across the northern horizon, the individual buildings burning visible through the smoke. The heat came across the water. Not the full heat of the fire, the river provided distance, but the specific warmth that a very large fire radiates over a significant distance, the warmth of something burning with enormous energy, perceptible even in the middle of the river. The sky above the city was a specific color, not the blue of a clear September sky. The specific orange-red color of reflected fire against smoke, the color that observers consistently describe in their accounts of the fire with a particular emotional register. The beauty of it, that terrible beauty, the fire's light in the sky above the city having a quality that multiple observers noted was, in its specific visual character, extraordinary. You could not look away. Even from the river, surrounded by the desolation of displaced Londoners, the fire had a quality that compelled attention. Pepys writes about it. Evelyn writes about it. Multiple accounts from the fire's witnesses use the same language. The sky was remarkable, the light was extraordinary, the city burning was in some terrible way beautiful. This is one of the specific uncomfortable truths about large fires. They are visually spectacular in ways that the disaster's scale does not override. The specific combination of scale and light that a large fire produces is one of the most striking things that human beings witness. And the witnesses of the Great Fire were honest about the fact that they were, alongside their terror and their grief, watching something that engaged their senses in a way that beauty engages them. Let me give you the night. Because the Great Fire at night had its own specific character. During the day, the smoke obscured the fire's light and the sun competed with it. At night, the fire became the primary light source for the city. September 2nd, the first night of the fire. The people on the river in their boats could see by the fire's light. The people in the fields north of the city, the hundreds of thousands of displaced Londoners who were camping with their possessions outside the city walls, having nowhere to go, could see by the fire's light. The fire lit the fields. Multiple accounts describe the specific quality of a night that was not dark, the specific orange light of the fire eliminating the normal darkness of a September night and replacing it with something that looked like the end of the world. The light on the fields, the people in the fields, their possessions around them, the city burning behind them. A woman who had been a servant in a household in Cheapside. Her name is not in the records, but her AC count is paraphrased in a letter from her employer, described sitting in the fields north of the city on the night of September 2nd with the other members of the household, surrounded by their salvaged goods, watching the fire. She described the light. She described the sound, the fire's roar, audible even at the distance of the fields, the specific sound of something very large burning very intensely. She described the specific cold of the September night in the field, which was unexpected after the warmth of the summer. She described the other people in the field, the families with their goods, the horses and the carts, the crying children, the specific social compression of an enormous city's population suddenly sharing an open field. She described not knowing what to do. That is the specific emotional content of the night. The not knowing what to do, combined with the inability to do anything, combined with the fire's light making the doing of anything a spectacle rather than a fact. She sat in the field. The city burned. She watched. Let me now give you the third day. September 4th. The fire had been burning for 2 days. In those 2 days, it had consumed the eastern and central sections of the city of London, the commercial heart, the dock areas, the residential neighborhoods packed with timber buildings. On September 4th, the fire was moving west. It was approaching the area around the Navy office, Pepys's workplace, and the workplace of the people who managed the Navy's administration. Pepys, on the 4th, did something that the records document with particular vividness. He removed his valuables. The specific list of things he removed and how he removed them is one of the great fire accounts that the modern reader finds both practical and human. The bags of gold carried to the garden of a friend, the specific important documents taken from the Navy office, the account book secured. And then, at dawn on the 5th, he and his colleague Mr. Gibson buried his gold in the garden. In the field north of the Navy office. In a hole like the woman with the parmesan. The specific action of a man who had spent 4 days watching the fire come closer, who had run out of options for moving his valuables to a safe place, who had resolved to put them in the ground. He buried the gold. He buried it badly. The specific account describes him and Gibson, working in the dark, not being sure afterward where exactly they had buried it. The subsequent account of Pepys digging up his own gold with his father, by candlelight, in the wrong part of the garden, is one of the great fire's more specifically comic moments. The gold was found. The Navy office survived. The fire was stopped before it reached Seething Lane, by the fire breaks created around the Navy office in the final day. The gold came out of the ground. The parmesan was retrieved. The city survived to bury its valuables and retrieve them again. Let me give you the stopping. Because the fire stopped. It did not burn itself out. The city's timber was extensive enough that the fire could have burned for much longer. It stopped because of the fire breaks, the demolition of buildings ahead of the fire's advance that had been intensifying through the final 2 days, combined with the specific change in the wind on September 5th. The wind dropped. Not to nothing, it continued, but the specific force that had been driving the fire west diminished. And the fire breaks held. The fire reached the fire break at Pie Corner to the north, a specific line of demolished buildings, and was unable to cross it. The fire reached the temple to the west and was stopped. The fire stopped. September 5th, 1666. The fire that had started in a bakery on Pudding Lane, that had consumed 373 acres of London, that had destroyed 87 churches and more than 13,000 houses, and the medieval cathedral and the Royal Exchange and the Guildhall and the homes and businesses and churches and halls of one of the greatest cities in Europe. This fire stopped. It stopped smoldering in some areas for days after. The specific underground heat of a fire that has burned through the cellars and into the foundations of buildings persisted for weeks in some areas, but the advancing front was stopped. London was mostly ruins. Let me give you the aftermath. Because the 4 days of the fire are the famous part of the story. What came after, the weeks and months and years of reconstruction, is less famous and equally important. Immediately after the fire, the problem of the displaced. Approximately 100,000 people, a quarter of London's population, had lost their homes. The fields outside the city were full of their encampments, the specific temporary world of a displaced urban population trying to manage without shelter, food, or the basic infrastructure that the city had provided. The king issued proclamations. He organized the distribution of food and materials to the displaced. He specifically prohibited the local market towns from price gouging the refugees, the specific economic exploitation of people who had no choice but to buy was a recognized problem that the royal authority moved to address. The specific shelter problem was managed, imperfectly, by the surrounding areas, the villages and towns around London absorbing some of the displaced population, the churches providing charity and accommodation, the more fortunate displaced London citizens having relatives or business connections in other parts of the country they could go to. The less fortunate the fields. London in September 1666 was cold at night. The summer was over. The specific combination of the autumn cold and the loss of shelter was a genuine humanitarian crisis, and it was managed with the specific combination of royal authority and civic charity and private commercial calculation that characterized 17th-century responses to disaster. The displaced were housed gradually. The reconstruction began almost immediately. Not waiting, the specific commercial energy of the London merchant class was not one that could be contained even by a disaster of this scale. The merchants whose warehouses had burned were already writing letters about new leases and new stock. The builders were surveying the ruins for what could be rebuilt. The specific practical energy of a commercial city meeting a commercial problem. Let me tell you about Christopher Wren. Because the Great Fire's most lasting legacy is architectural, and the architect at the center of that legacy is one of the most important figures in English history. Christopher Wren was 34 years old in September 1666. He was already a significant figure, a professor of astronomy at Oxford, a mathematician of considerable skill, a member of the Royal Society. He had been involved in architectural projects before the fire, including the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford, but architecture was not yet his primary professional identity. The fire changed that. Within weeks of the fire's end, Wren had produced a plan for the reconstruction of London, a specific design plan, a formal grid of streets replacing the medieval organic city. The plan was not adopted. The property rights of the existing landowners were too complicated. The legal disputes over who owned what in the ruins were too extensive, and the specific commercial urgency of rebuilding quickly was incompatible with the time required to implement a formal planned reconstruction. London was rebuilt roughly on its existing street plan, with modifications. But Wren was appointed to oversee the reconstruction of the churches. 87 churches had been destroyed. Wren rebuilt 51 of them, and he built St. Paul's Cathedral. The specific process of designing and building the new St. Paul's, which Wren worked on from the early 1670s to its completion in 1710, was one of the most significant architectural projects in English history. The cathedral he designed was not the Gothic medieval cathedral that had burned. It was a classical cathedral, with the dome that has dominated the London skyline ever since. The dome that you see in photographs of London's skyline is Wren's response to the fire. The specific silver dome, visible from most parts of the city, was the reconstruction's defining monument. It is still there. Let me give you the specific smell. Because the Great Fire's smell is documented with a consistency that gives us the specific sensory reality of the disaster. The smell of a city burning is not the smell of a campfire or a fireplace. It is the smell of everything. The wood burning is part of it, the specific warm smoke smell of timber. But a city contains more than wood. It contains the specific stored contents of warehouses, the cotton and the cloth and the food and the wine and the specific goods of commerce. It contains the contents of churches, the specific materials of religious life, the candles and the incense and the wooden furnishings. It contains the lead of roofs, which melts at a lower temperature than stone and which produces a specific smell as it volatilizes. And the lead of St. Paul's. the specific smell of molten lead in enormous quantities, running through the streets around the cathedral. Multiple observers noted a specific heavy, metallic, hot smell that was unlike anything else, and that marked the air around St. Paul's as the cathedral burned. The smell of the fire was the smell of everything. It was also the smell of the medieval city. The medieval London that had grown organically over centuries, the specific accumulation of a city built by human habitation, was burning, and its burning produced a smell that was the smell of the end of something. The medieval city. The smell of it burning. The dome that came after. Let me give you what came after, more specifically. The rebuilding of London was governed by the London Rebuilding Act of 1667, which set specific standards for the new construction. No more wood. The specific requirement: new buildings to be built in brick or stone. This was not immediately popular with the builders and the property owners who were trying to rebuild quickly and cheaply. Brick and stone were more expensive than timber. Brick and stone buildings took longer to build. The requirement was enforced. The London that emerged from the Great Fire's rebuilding was a different city from the London that had burned. The new buildings were wider. The street-widening requirements of the Act provided for slightly broader streets. The buildings were of brick, the specific warm red brick of London's 18th-century streetscapes. The buildings were more uniform. The regulations prescribed standard heights and proportions. And the new London did not burn in the same way. The medieval timber city had been a fire waiting to happen. The brick London that replaced it was not fireproof. Fires continued to occur, but the specific vulnerability of the tightly packed timber building stock to the rapid spread of fire was reduced by the shift to brick. The specific lesson of the Great Fire, that a wooden city in a drought is a tinderbox, was built into the regulations. The regulations produced a different city. The city is still there. The buildings of the late 17th and early 18th century that the Ren-era rebuilding produced, many of them are still standing. The streets of the city of London, still following roughly the medieval pattern, are lined with buildings from the rebuilding period. The fire shaped the city. The city shaped what came after. Let me give you the specific question of blame. Because the Great Fire of London was followed immediately by the search for someone to blame, and the search for blame was conducted in the specific context of a city and a country already anxious about foreign plots. A Frenchman named Robert Hubert claimed, shortly after the fire, to have started it deliberately. He confessed. He was tried. He was convicted. He was hanged. He was almost certainly innocent. The specific details of his confession did not align with the known facts of the fire's start. He placed himself at the bakery at a time when he was demonstrably not there, described a mode of fire starting that was inconsistent with the fire's actual behavior, and his mental state was questioned by multiple observers. But the confession was convenient. A city that wanted someone to blame, that wanted the fire to be the result of a deliberate foreign Catholic plot, rather than the accident of an inadequately supervised oven, found in Robert Hubert's confession what it was looking for. He was hanged. The inscription on the monument, the treachery and malice of the popish faction, was the permanent public memorial of this specific desire for external blame. The inscription was wrong. The fire was accidental. The need for blame was human and comprehensible. The consequence for Robert Hubert was death. Let me now tell you about the monument itself. Because the monument to the Great Fire of London is one of the more extraordinary commemorative structures in the history of European cities, and it deserves attention. It is a column, a freestanding fluted column, 202 feet tall, standing approximately 202 feet from where Farriner's Bakery stood on Pudding Lane. If it fell westward, It would touch the exact spot where the fire started. This is intentional. Wren designed it with Robert Hooke, and the specific mathematical relationship between the column's height and its distance from the fire's origin was deliberate. It was completed in 1677, 11 years after the fire. At its base, the inscriptions, originally including the treachery and malice of the popish faction, which was carved into the stone and which remained there until 1831, when it was finally chiseled off. At its top, a gilded urn with flames. The monument is 202 feet tall, because that is the distance to the bakery. The column is a measuring instrument as well as a commemoration, the specific height chosen to communicate the fire's origin through the column's geometry. It is also in the specific tradition of memorial architecture, a statement about the city's relationship with what happened to it. We acknowledge the fire, we mark where it started, we are still here. The monument is still there. In the city of London. 202 feet tall. 202 feet from where it started. Sleep now. You have been in London on fire tonight. In Thomas Farriner's bakery, in the small hours of September 2nd. In the Lord Mayor's ill-judged assessment of the situation. With Samuel Pepys watching the pigeons that wouldn't leave the burning houses. With John Langton moving his cloth inventory against the fire's advance. With the woman burying her parmesan in the garden. With the king on horseback, handing out money to the men with fire hooks. With the watching from the river, the fire's light on the water, the specific terrible beauty. With the woman in the field north of the city, not knowing what to do. With the gold buried in the wrong part of the garden. With the lead from St. Paul's running in the streets. With the 100,000 people in the fields, cold in the September night. With Wren's dome rising above the ruins. With the monument, 202 feet tall, 202 feet from the bakery. The city burned. The city was rebuilt. The dome is still there. The monument is still there. The streets are roughly where they were before the fire, the medieval pattern, somewhat widened in brick rather than timber, but roughly where they were. Pudding Lane still exists. The bakery's site has a small plaque. The fire happened. The city survived. Sleep. Good night. Thank you for tonight. The Great Fire of London is one of the events that shaped modern British history in ways that are still visible in the dome of St. Paul's, in the brick buildings of the city, in the specific regulations that rebuilt a medieval city as a modern one. Subscribe if dull tales is your evening company. Leave a comment. Tell me if you've been to the monument. Tell me if you've stood at the site of the bakery. Next time, the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan and how it fed 200,000 people before the Spanish arrived. But tonight, the fire, the wind, the lead in the streets, the gold in the garden. Good night. Let me give you the specific experience of a Londoner who did not flee. Because not everyone fled. Some people stayed. Not because they couldn't flee, some couldn't. The elderly and the sick, and the people without the means to transport themselves or their possessions. But some people stayed who could have fled, making the specific calculation that remaining near their property gave them the best chance of protecting what they had. A man named Edward Wentworth was a goldsmith with premises in Cheapside, approximately half a mile from the fire's origin. On the morning of September 2nd, when the fire was still to the east, and its advance was still a matter of uncertainty, he stayed. He organized his shop. He moved the most valuable inventory, the gold and silver work, the specific finished pieces that represented the greatest concentration of value, into the most fire-resistant part of his premises, a stone cellar that he believed would survive if the building burned. He was wrong about the cellar's fire resistance. He did not know this yet. He stayed. He watched the fires advance through the day. He updated his calculation repeatedly. In the late afternoon of September 2nd, with the fire still to the east but advancing faster than the morning had suggested, he made the decision to move the inventory. He hired a cart. The cart cost him several times what it would have cost in ordinary times, the specific price inflation of a city in emergency, where the supply of carts and the people to drive them was suddenly dramatically less than the demand. He paid. He loaded. He moved the inventory to a location north of the city with a business associate. He went back. He stayed as long as he could. He left when the fire was clearly going to reach his premises. He lost the building. He did not lose the inventory. He rebuilt within a year. This is the specific practical intelligence of the London merchant class. The rapid updating of the situation, the willingness to pay extraordinary prices for necessary services when necessary, the specific calculation of what can be saved and what cannot, the forward orientation even in the midst of the disaster. London's commercial class rebuilt the city quickly because it thought about the problem of rebuilding while the city was still burning. Let me give you the specific geography of the fire. Because the fire's path through the city is specific and traceable, and the specific geography of what burned and what survived tells you something important about the disaster. The fire started on Pudding Lane, near the Thames. It burned west and north, driven by the east wind. The areas it consumed, the eastern waterfront, the commercial heart of the city, the dense residential neighborhoods of the medieval city, the great civic buildings, the Guildhall, the Royal Exchange, the churches, and St. Paul's Cathedral. The areas it did not consume, the areas north of the city, Moorfield, Smithfield, where the wind did not carry the fire, the legal quarter of the Inns of Court, which survived because of specific fire breaks, the eastern suburbs, Whitechapel and Stepney, which were outside the main fire's path, the wealthy residential areas to the west, the Strand, Covent Garden, the specific aristocratic neighborhoods that were outside the medieval city walls, were not significantly affected. This geographic specificity has a social dimension. The fire burned primarily in the city, the commercial and working-class areas of London. The wealthy West End was not burned. The people most affected were the merchants and the tradespeople and the working poor of the city. The wealthy who had moved to the West End experienced the fire primarily as spectators, as people who watched from a distance, who took in the refugees, who experienced the logistical challenges of a disrupted city without having lost their own homes. The social geography of the fire's damage was not random. It was shaped by the geography of the wind and the location of the fire's origin, and the result was that the disaster fell most heavily on the commercial and working class of the city, and less heavily on the aristocracy of the West End. This is not a conspiracy. This is geography. But the geography produced a specific social distribution of loss that shaped the specific character of the reconstruction. Let me give you more of the sounds. Because the Great Fire was not only a visual event, it was a sonic event, and the sounds of the fire are documented by the witnesses with a consistency that gives us the specific acoustic character of the disaster. The roar. Multiple observers use this word, the roar of the fire, not the crackling of an ordinary fire. The specific sound of an enormous fire burning across a large area, the combined sound of thousands of individual fires creating a collective noise that was distinct from anything else. A sound like wind, some said. A sound like the sea, said others. The specific analogy to natural sound, the fire sounding like a natural phenomenon, is interesting. The fire that burned like a natural force was also sounding like one. The specific crack and crash of buildings collapsing. The timber buildings of medieval London, as they burned through, collapsed. The specific sound of a burning building's structural failure, the crack of the timber, the crash of the falling walls, the specific sudden impact sound of a building collapsing into its own footprint, was one of the sounds of the fire. Multiple per hour. The specific rhythm of the fire's sound, the continuous roar, punctuated by the specific percussive crashes of individual building collapses. For the people on the river or in the fields, this sound was the specific auditory evidence of the fire's progress. You could hear the city falling. The woman in the field, the servant from Cheapside whose account we have in paraphrase, described lying awake through the night of September 2nd, listening to the crashes. She could not see, in the darkness of the field, which specific buildings were falling. But she could count the crashes. She listened to the city fall. Let me give you the political context. Because the Great Fire happened in a specific political moment in English history, and the politics shaped how the fire was understood and responded to. 1666 was the year of the Second Anglo-Dutch War, a commercial and naval conflict between England and the Dutch Republic that had been running since 1665. London was at war. The specific anxieties of a city at war, the anxieties about invasion, about foreign plots, about the security of the capital, were the background to the fire. The year was also, for certain religious traditions, significant numerologically. 1666, the number of the beast, the year 666, was a year that some saw as prophetically significant. The fire, arriving in this year, was interpreted by some as a divine judgment. And England had been through significant political upheaval in the preceding decades. The Civil War, the execution of Charles I in 1649, the Republic under Cromwell, the restoration of Charles II in 1660. The specific political turbulence of the mid-17th century had left the English political landscape anxious and uncertain. The Great Fire arrived in a city and a country that had recently experienced profound political discontinuity, and that was still working out the specific political arrangements of the restored monarchy. The king's response to the fire, his personal presence at the firefighting effort, his organization of the relief effort, the specific royal leadership that the crisis required, was not just a practical response. It was also a political statement. The restored monarchy was capable of managing a national emergency. The king was present. The king was working. The fire was, among its other dimensions, a political test of the restored monarchy. Charles II passed the test. His personal popularity increased in the aftermath of the fire, despite the fire itself, and despite the questions about how quickly and effectively the initial response had been organized. The king was in the streets. The king was in the smoke. The people saw him. Let me give you the specific character of the ruins. Because the ruins of the Great Fire had their own specific character, the specific physical aftermath that the city's population moved through in the days and weeks following the fire. The ruins were hot. Not immediately, by September 6th, the fire's main front was out, but the underground heat of burned-out buildings persisted for weeks. Cellars and foundations that had burned through retained heat in the specific way of masonry that has absorbed a long-burning fire, and the city's surface, in many areas, was too hot to walk across comfortably. The ruins smelled of the fire. The specific smell of burned wood and burned goods and burned buildings. The charcoal smell, the metallic smell of burned and cooled metals, the specific combination of materials that had been reduced to ash and were still releasing volatile compounds, was the smell of the ruined city for weeks. The ruins were also, in some places, spectacular. The specific visual quality of the ruined city, the stone walls of buildings that had survived the fire's structural destruction but whose timber interiors had burned, standing alone in the rubble like the walls of a theatrical set, was described by multiple observers with a quality of strange beauty. John Evelyn walked through the ruins in the days after the fire. He described the scene with the specific combination of grief and aesthetic response that ruins often produce in observers. The beauty of the surviving stone walls, the specific quality of light in the open spaces where buildings had stood, the strange landscape of a city that had been remade into something that looked like a ruined ancient civilization. He compared it to Rome. The ruins of ancient Rome, which the educated Englishman of the 17th century knew from his classical education, were the specific frame through which Evelyn processed what he was seeing. London in ruins. Like Rome, except that London was going to rebuild. Rome had not rebuilt. London had. Let me give you the specific stories of rebuilding. Because the reconstruction of London after the Great Fire was one of the most remarkable urban rebuilding projects in European history, and it happened faster than most people expect. The city was largely burned in September 1666. By 1676, 10 years later, most of the city had been rebuilt. Not slowly, not painfully, but with the specific commercial energy of a city that needed to be functioning again because its commerce required it. The merchants needed warehouses. The tradespeople needed workshops. The residents needed houses. The churches needed to be replaced. The rebuilding happened because there was commercial pressure to rebuild quickly. The specific mechanism. The London Rebuilding Act of 1667 resolved the legal questions about property rights in the ruins. Who owned what? Who had the right to rebuild? How the new buildings had to be constructed? And the commercial pressure of the surviving merchant class translated quickly into building activity. The new brick buildings rose from the ruins. Wren's churches, the 51 churches he rebuilt, rose from the ruins of the 87 that had burned. The new St. Paul's, the dome, the classical design, the specific architectural achievement of a lifetime of work, rose slowly, completed in 1710. The monument was built. The city that emerged was recognizably London. Roughly the same street pattern, the same locations, the same general organization of commercial and residential and civic space, but built in a different material, with different buildings, with the specific character of a city reconstructed according to the design principles of the Restoration period rather than the organic growth principles of the medieval city. The rebuilding was one of the great architectural projects of English history, and it was driven, primarily, by the commercial urgency of getting the city functioning again. London was not rebuilt for beauty. It was rebuilt because London needed to be London. The beauty followed. Let me give you the specific human scale of the loss. Because the statistics, 13,200 houses, 87 churches, 373 acres, are the aggregate, the human scale is different. Consider what 13,200 houses means. In 1666, a London house typically housed a family, a nuclear family, often with servants and sometimes with apprentices or lodgers. The average household size was perhaps 5 to 8 people. 13,200 houses times 5 to 8 people, approximately 65,000 to 100,000 people who lost their homes. In a city of 400,000, this was approximately a quarter of the population. A quarter of the city homeless. Not temporarily inconvenienced. Homeless, having lost everything in the building that the fire had consumed. The specific material losses are more difficult to calculate. The contents of 13,200 houses, the furniture, the clothing, the household goods, the specific accumulated possessions of families who had lived in those houses for years or decades, were mostly lost. Some had been evacuated, most had not. The specific material culture of the medieval London household, the things that ordinary people owned, the specific objects of their daily lives, was largely destroyed in the fire. The personal losses. Not the commercial losses, those, as we have seen, the merchants were already calculating and beginning to address. The personal losses, the specific objects that had meaning, the portrait of a deceased parent, the piece of jewelry inherited from a grandmother, the specific books that a literate Londoner had accumulated. These were gone. And the churches. 87 churches. In the 17th century, a church was not only a building for Sunday services. It was the center of a specific community's life, the place of baptisms and marriages and funerals, the physical anchor of a specific neighborhood's identity. The loss of 87 churches was the loss of the specific physical community structures of 87 neighborhoods. Some of those churches Ren rebuilt. Some he did not. Some neighborhoods never got their church back in the same way. The loss was specific. It was also eventually addressed. The city rebuilt its churches. It could not rebuild what had been in them. The specific medieval art and the specific medieval furnishings and the specific accumulated devotional objects of centuries, those were gone. The architecture was replaced. The content was not. Let me give you Pepys's specific account of the days after. Because Pepys's diary does not stop when the fire stops. He continued writing, and what he wrote in the days after the fire is as illuminating as what he wrote during it. On September 6th, the day after the fire was largely stopped, he walked through the ruins. He described the specific landscape of the ruined city with the same meticulous detail that characterized his diary's best passages. The heat of the ground underfoot, the specific quality of the ruined buildings, the people moving through the ruins looking for what remained of their properties. He also described the specific smell and the specific emotional quality of the walk through a city that had been his city for his entire adult life, and that was now largely gone. He described grief. Not the theatrical grief of public mourning, but the specific private grief of someone walking through a ruined landscape and finding that the specific places that had organized his spatial and emotional relationship to a city, the church where he had been married, the street where he had bought his favorite oysters, were gone. The city that Pepys had known was gone. A different city would be built on its ruins. The city that was built was, in many ways, better, wider streets, brick construction, the specific classical architecture of the Wren churches, the dome of St. Paul's. But it was not the city Pepys had known. The old city was gone. He walked through its ruins. He grieved. He wrote it down. He went back to work. And now the close. The fire happened. The lead ran in the streets around St. Paul's. The Parmesan was buried in the garden. The gold was buried in the wrong part of the garden. The woman in the field watched the city burn and did not know what to do. The city burned. The city was rebuilt. The dome rose from the ruins. The monument was built, 202 feet tall, 202 feet from where it started. The new London, brick, slightly wider streets, the specific classical architecture of the late 17th century replaced the old London. And then the new London was lived in for centuries. And then it was lived in some more. And the dome is still there. And the monument is still there. And Pudding Lane still exists. And the site of the bakery has a small plaque. And somewhere in the London that exists today, in the streets that roughly follow the medieval pattern, in the churches that Wren built from the ruins, in the specific way that the city was shaped by the disaster, and by the rebuilding, the fire is still present. Not as a wound. As the city. Sleep. The dome is lit tonight. The monument is dark. The city is quiet. Good night. Let me give you the specific experience of the fire from the perspective of the Thames watermen. Because the Thames watermen, the men who operated the ferries and the wherries and the small boats that were the primary means of river transport, were in a specific and complicated position during the Great Fire. The Thames watermen were everywhere during the fire. They were the specific transportation infrastructure that the fire's displaced population needed most. The boats that could carry people and goods out of the fire's path, across the river, or upstream to safety. Their business, normally constrained by the specific economics of ferry transport, was suddenly very different. Demand was unlimited. Supply was constrained by the number of boats and boatmen available. The price of a Thames boat ride during the Great Fire of London is documented in multiple sources. It was extraordinary. The specific price inflation that occurred, watermen charging 10, 20, 50 times the normal rate for their services, taking advantage of the specific desperation of people who had no other option, was one of the less admirable features of the fire's human record. It was also predictable, and it was addressed. The king specifically issued orders prohibiting the watermen from price gouging during the emergency. The specific royal intervention in the market, the attempt to control prices in a crisis, is documented, and it was partially effective. But the watermen had leverage that was very difficult to override. They had the boats. The people needed the boats. Some of the watermen charged what the market would bear. Some of them did not. A waterman named Thomas Cooper, operating out of Southwark on the south bank of the Thames, is mentioned in the surviving accounts as one of the watermen who did not price gouge, who charged his standard rate, who made many crossings during the fire, who transported people and goods across the river without taking advantage of the emergency. His specific motivation for this is not recorded. He may have been religious. He may have been practical. The specific calculation that a reputation for fair dealing was worth more in the long run than the short-term gain of emergency pricing. He may have been simply decent. Whatever his motivation, he charged his standard rate. He made many crossings. He transported the people who needed transportation. The fire did not stop, but the crossings happened. The people moved. Some of them survived the fire's advance because Thomas Cooper had a boat and charged a reasonable price. Let me give you the specific animals of the Great Fire. Because the fire's witnesses noted the animals, the specific observations of how the city's animal population responded to the disaster, and these observations are one of the more humanizing elements of the Great Fire's record. The pigeons. Pepys's specific observation. The pigeons of London were reluctant to leave their buildings as the fire approached. They fluttered around the burning buildings, returning to rooftops that were themselves beginning to smoke, unable to make the specific calculation that the fire required them to make, that this particular perch was no longer viable until it was too late. Many pigeons burned. This specific detail, the detail that the pigeons would not leave, has stayed in the historical record of the Great Fire because it is specific and strange and somehow very sad. The bird's specific failure of survival instinct in the face of an unprecedented event. The horses. The horses that pulled the carts that were moving the city's goods during the evacuation were working at maximum capacity for 4 days. The specific exhaustion of working animals pushed beyond normal limits by the emergency's demands. Multiple accounts note horses being worked to the point of collapse. The cattle and pigs and sheep that were kept in the city, in the specific urban agriculture that characterized the 17th century city, these were lost in many cases. The specific animals of the city's food economy, kept in yards and in the markets near Smithfield, were caught by the fire in some areas. The cats. Cats are mentioned in several accounts, in the specific context of the cats of the city churches. The cats that were kept to manage the rodent populations of the church buildings, being seen fleeing the fire. The animals were in the fire. They responded in ways that are entirely recognizable. The pigeons that wouldn't leave, the horses that worked until they couldn't, the cats that ran. The specific animal observation in a disaster is always one of the more emotionally accessible elements for the people who witness it. The human losses are enormous and abstract. The pigeons that wouldn't leave are specific and comprehensible. Let me give you the fire's impact on the city's food supply. Because London was fed from specific markets and warehouses, and the Great Fire destroyed significant portions of that food infrastructure, and the feeding of the city, and of the 100,000 newly homeless, was a practical challenge of considerable difficulty. The fish markets on the Thames waterfront were among the first areas consumed. The Leadenhall Market, the major market for poultry and meat in the city, was destroyed. The bakers, whose ovens were one of the primary sources of bread for the city's population, lost their premises in large numbers. The specific disruption to the food supply of a city of 400,000 was serious. It was managed not perfectly, but adequately through a combination of the city's surrounding food infrastructure, the markets in the areas not consumed by the fire, the food imports through the Thames that continued, and the specific royal intervention. The proclamations directing food supplies to the displaced population, the organization of distribution. But in the immediate aftermath of the fire, the days when the ruins were still too hot to walk through, when the markets were gone and the bakers were homeless, the food supply of the displaced Londoners was precarious. The specific experience of hunger in the aftermath of the fire is documented in the accounts of the displaced. Not mass starvation. The surrounding areas had food. The food reached the displaced through the distribution channels that the king had organized. But the specific disruption of the comfortable assumption of available food, the specific experience of not knowing where the next meal was coming from, was part of the fire's immediate aftermath. The city was fed. It took effort and organization. The food reached the people in the fields. Let me give you what the fire meant for the churches. Because the religious dimension of the Great Fire, the destruction of 87 churches, the burning of St. Paul's, the specific impact on the religious life of a city for which the church was central, is one of the aspects of the disaster that the modern reader least intuitively understands. In the 17th century, the parish church was not only a building for Sunday services. It was the administrative center of the parish. The records of baptisms, marriages, and burials were kept in the parish church. These records were the specific documentation of the population's vital statistics, the equivalent of the modern civil registration that was not established until the 19th century. When the churches burned, the records burned. The specific genealogical record of the families who had lived in those parishes, centuries of baptism and marriage and burial records, was destroyed. This loss is not dramatic in the way that the physical destruction of the cathedral was dramatic, but it was a significant loss of historical record. The baptism record that would have established someone's legal status. The marriage record that would have proved an inheritance. The burial record that would have shown where an ancestor was laid. The churches burned. The records burned with them. Wren rebuilt the churches. The records could not be rebuilt. The churches were also, and this is perhaps easier to understand, the specific places that organized communities' emotional relationship with the major events of their lives. A Londoner of the 17th century had been baptized in a church, had been married in a church, had buried parents and children and neighbors in the churchyard, had attended that specific church through a lifetime of Sundays and holy days. When the church burned, the specific place where all of that had happened was gone. Not the events they had happened, but the place that had anchored them in the specific physical world, the building whose stones and windows and smell had been the backdrop to the life's most important moments, was ash. Ren built new churches. The new churches were beautiful. They were not the same churches. Let me give you the specific experience of the days after. The city in the days after September 5th was a specific landscape. The ruins, the heat of the ground, the people moving through the ruins, some looking for what remained of their properties, some looking for others who had been lost, some simply witnessing. The smell, the specific quality of light in a city with fewer buildings, the sky more visible, the horizon more open, the specific different light of a city that has lost its built fabric. The camps in the fields north of the city. The people returning, one by one, as their specific housing arrangements were resolved, moving in with relatives, finding lodgings in the undamaged parts of the city, beginning the specific long process of rebuilding. The workers arriving, the builders, the carpenters, the bricklayers, the specific construction trades that would rebuild the city, arriving to assess the ruins and begin the work. The first new buildings going up. Not immediately, the ruins had to cool, the legal questions about who owned what had to begin to be resolved, the materials had to be sourced. But quickly. The city was rebuilding within months. And Pepys was back at his desk. He wrote in his diary. He worked. He was Londoner enough to rebuild alongside the city. And finally, truly the close. There is a specific kind of resilience that cities have. It is not the resilience of individual people, the specific courage of a person who faces a difficulty and endures it. It is the resilience of a community that has collective needs more urgent than any individual's grief. London needed to be London. London needed to be a port, a market, a center of commerce, a political capital, a place where 400,000 people lived and worked and ate and slept. The fire had destroyed the infrastructure of that, but not the 400,000 people. The 400,000 people were in the fields and on the river, and in the undamaged streets, and in the houses of cousins in other cities. They were not gone. They needed somewhere to be. So London was rebuilt. Not because Londoners were especially heroic. Not because the city had access to some special reserve of civic virtue. Because London needed to exist. And the people who needed it to exist built it. This is the resilience of cities. It is not beautiful, it is practical. But the result, the city that Wren rebuilt, the dome that rose from the ruins, the brick streets that replaced the wooden ones, this is beautiful. The practical thing became the beautiful thing. The fire happened. The city was built. The dome is lit. Sleep. Good night. Let me give you more of the characters and more of the texture. Let me give you a specific family. William and Mary Carter were a shoemaker and his wife who lived in Cornhill, one of the central commercial streets of the city of London. William made shoes in his workshop on the ground floor. Mary ran the household above. Their children, 3 of them, aged 8, 11, and 14, lived in the house. They were woken on the morning of September 2nd by a neighbor. The neighbor said, "There is a fire in Pudding Lane." William went out to look. He came back. He said, "It is to the east and moving west." They had, by William's calculation, several hours before the fire could reach Cornhill. He was approximately right. But the fire moved faster than his calculation allowed for, and the several hours turned into 2 hours, and the specific urgency of the final packing was compressed by the speed of the fire's advance. What they took. Mary took the best clothing, the specific 17th century understanding of clothing as significant wealth meant that the clothing was the first priority for many households. William took his tools, the specific tools of the shoemaker's trade, without which he could not work and rebuild his business. Without the tools, the business could not restart. The tools were the business. The children were organized to carry what they could, the specific domestic contribution of children in emergencies, carrying the lighter items, moving at the pace of the adults' direction. They took what they could take in 2 hours. They left the furniture. They left the workshop's leather stock, too heavy, too bulky to carry quickly. They left the house. They went north. The house burned. The workshop burned. The leather burned. The furniture burned. William had his tools. Mary had the clothing. The children were uninjured. They were in the fields north of the city, with hundreds of thousands of other displaced Londoners. William began making inquiries, in the field, about available premises in the undamaged areas. By September 10th, 8 days after the fire started, he had found a temporary workshop in a house in Clerkenwell, north of the city, owned by a man who had agreed to let him use the space in exchange for a reduced rent while the city was being rebuilt. He began making shoes. Mary made arrangements for lodging. The children helped. By October, they had a functioning, if temporary, household. By the following spring, William was working from a new permanent premises in the rebuilt section of the city. The family survived. The family rebuilt. This is the specific human story of the Great Fire, not the spectacular drama of the disaster, but the specific ordinary practical work of rebuilding a life after disaster. The tools that William carried. The house that he rented in Clerkenwell. The shoes he made in September and October 1666. Let me give you the specific experience of the clergy. Because the clergy of the city's churches faced a specific kind of loss in the Great Fire, not the personal loss of home and goods, though many of them experienced that too, but the specific professional and spiritual loss of the churches that were their charges. A vicar named Thomas Sunderland had served the parish of St. Lawrence Jewry for 12 years in 1666. His church was in the center of the city, near the Guildhall. His church burned. The records of his parish, the baptisms, the marriages, the burials, the specific accumulated documentation of his parish's life, burned with it. He survived. He was, like most of the city's clergy, displaced by the fire. His vicarage was adjacent to the church and burned when the church burned. He was housed temporarily by a parishioner who had a house in the undamaged area. In the weeks and months after the fire, he continued his pastoral work, visiting his displaced parishioners, conducting services where space allowed, maintaining the specific pastoral relationships that were his work regardless of whether there was a building to house them. He was one of the clergy. Ho participated in Rennes' rebuilding process, providing the specific requirements of the parish's liturgical needs to the architect who was designing the new church. St. Lawrence Jewry was rebuilt, one of the 51 churches that Rennes rebuilt. Thomas Sunderland served the rebuilt church until his death. The specific grief of having watched his church burn, the building where he had conducted the ceremonies of his parishioners' lives for 12 years, was something he carried. The new church was built. He was grateful for it. It was not the same church. He served it anyway. Let me give you the specific week of reconstruction. September 10th through September 17th, 1666. The fire was 5 to 12 days behind. The ruins were still hot in places. The city was beginning to organize itself around the problem of rebuilding. The first action, surveying the ruins. Surveyors were sent into the ruins to map what had burned and what had survived, to identify the property boundaries in the specific way that legal ownership could begin to be established, to create the baseline document that the rebuilding would be organized from. The surveyors moved through the ruins. Hot ground, the smell of the ash, the specific strange beauty of the ruined city. They drew maps. They noted what was where. They produced the specific documentation that property rights and rebuilding regulations would depend on. This was necessary work, done in specific difficult conditions by people who were doing it because it needed doing. The second action, clearing. The rubble of the burned buildings had to be moved before rebuilding could begin. The specific physical work of moving rubble by hand in carts to the specific disposal areas that were designated was labor on a massive scale. Thousands of workers, over months, cleared the rubble of 13,200 burned buildings. The rubble went, some of it to the Thames, dumped into the river, some of it used as fill in the construction of the wharves and the river walls, some of it used as material in the new buildings. Nothing was wasted. The rubble was a resource. The clearing created the blank surface on which the new city would be built. Let me give you the monument again, because I want to come back to it, because the monument is one of the more interesting commemorative decisions in the history of English cities, and it deserves more attention. The decision to build a monument to the fire at all, rather than simply rebuilding and moving on, was a specific cultural decision that says something about how the English of the late 17th century processed major disasters. They commemorated them, not just built new buildings on the ruins of the old, built a specific monument whose function was to mark what had happened, to make the fire a permanent part of the city's physical landscape, to say, this happened here in this place, and we are not going to pretend it didn't. The specific design of the monument, the column, the gilded flames at the top, the inscriptions, was designed by Wren and Robert Hooke together. The scientific precision of the column's height being exactly the distance to the fire's origin point was Hooke's contribution, the mathematician's specific elegant solution to the problem of how to use a monument's physical dimensions to communicate historical information. The monument is both a monument and a measuring instrument. It measures the distance to the disaster. It marks the disaster at that distance. It says, the fire started there. We know exactly where. We know exactly how far this column stands from that place. We have turned the measurement of the disaster into the form of the memorial. This is, among the various approaches to commemorating historical disasters that human cultures have developed, one of the more interesting. The monument has stood for 3.5 centuries. It is still, to this day, the tallest isolated stone column in the world. 202 feet. 202 feet from Pudding Lane. If it fell westward, it would touch the site of the bakery. Sleep now. The fire started in a bakery. The pigeons wouldn't leave. The Lord Mayor went back to bed. The gold was buried in the wrong part of the garden. The Parmesan survived. The lead from St. Paul's ran in the streets. The waterman charged a fair price. The woman in the field watched the city fall. The king was in the streets, on horseback, handing out money to the men with the fire hooks. The fire stopped. The rubble was cleared. The surveyors mapped the ruins. William Carter found a workshop in Clerkenwell and made shoes. Thomas Sunderland served the new church. Wren built the dome. The monument was built, 202 feet tall, 202 feet from where it started. The city is there. The dome is lit. The monument is dark, but it is there. The site of the bakery has a small plaque. Pudding Lane still exists. Sleep. Good night. Let me give you the specific rebuilding of the Royal Exchange. Because the Royal Exchange was the commercial heart of the City of London, the specific building where the merchants of London met to conduct business, where the prices were set and the deals were made, and the specific commercial intelligence of a trading empire was exchanged, and its rebuilding tells you something about the priorities of the city after the fire. The Royal Exchange was the first major building to be rebuilt after the Great Fire. Not a church, not a civic building. The Royal Exchange, the specific commercial energy of the London merchant class, the specific urgency of getting the commercial infrastructure working again, was expressed in the priority given to rebuilding the building where commerce happened. The new Royal Exchange was opened by Charles II in 1669, 3 years after the fire. 3 years. The medieval St. Paul's, which had been standing for centuries and had been burned in the fire, was replaced by Rennes Cathedral, which was completed in 1710. 44 years. The Royal Exchange, 3 years. The commerce came first. This tells you what London was, in the most practical sense. A commercial city. A place that built cathedrals over 40 years, but rebuilt its trading floor in 3. This is not a criticism. This is the specific character of a city that understood what it was for. Let me give you John Evelyn's specific account. Because Pepys is the more famous diarist and his account is the more cited one, but Evelyn's account has a different quality. The quality of a man who was an older, more aesthetic observer whose specific response to the fire was shaped by his interest in architecture and his deep attachment to the city as a physical environment. Evelyn was 46 in September 1666. He was a writer, a diarist, a member of the Royal Society, a man of wide intellectual interests who had traveled extensively in Europe, and who brought to his observation of the fire the specific comparative frame of someone who had seen the great cities of the continent and understood London's place among them. He walked through the ruins on September 7th, 2 days after the fire was stopped. What he saw, the specific landscape of a great medieval city reduced to ash and stone walls. He described the ruins in terms that clearly reflect his architectural education, the specific observation of which structural forms had survived and which had not, the assessment of the ruins from the perspective of someone who thought about buildings in terms of structural logic. He was also, under the technical observation, grieving. He described the ruins of St. Paul's with a specific quality of grief. The medieval cathedral that he had known all his life, that was part of the specific landscape of the London he had always known, now gutted. He also, and this is one of the less comfortable aspects of his account, saw in the ruins an opportunity. Not a commercial opportunity, an architectural one. Evelyn submitted his own plan for the reconstruction of London, a plan based on the kind of formal city design that he had seen in Paris and Rome, a planned grid that would replace the medieval organic city with a designed city of the kind that contemporary European urban theory was developing. His plan was not adopted, just as Rennes' plan was not adopted. But the impulse behind it, the specific conviction that a rebuilt London should be a designed London, that the fire was a terrible thing that had created a specific opportunity that should not be wasted, is one of the more intellectually interesting responses to the disaster. The city that was rebuilt was not the planned city of Evelyn's vision or Rennes' vision. It was the organic city of the market and the landowner and the competing interests, built faster because it was built without a master plan. Faster, less beautiful, more like London. One more person. Let me give you an apprentice. His name was James Cooper. He was 17 years old in September 1666. He was apprenticed to a printer in Aldersgate Street, not far from the fire's path, but just outside the area that was ultimately consumed. His master's premises survived. He was one of the apprentices whose employer did not lose the workshop, who continued in the trade, whose specific situation was complicated by the fire not through the loss of his master's premises, but through the specific disruption to the trade's supply chains and customer base. London's printers depended on London's commercial and governmental establishments as their primary customers. The burned city was, for several months, a reduced market. The trade continued. James continued his apprenticeship. But the specific texture of his life in the autumn of 1666 was different from what it would have been without the fire. He walked through the ruins. He knew people who had lost their homes. He helped as young people. Help in disasters, with the specific practical tasks that needed doing, carrying things, running errands, the general labor of a community reorganizing itself. He finished his apprenticeship 2 years later. He became a printer. He eventually had his own shop. The fire was one of the events of his formative years. He carried it. Not as a scar, he had not been personally devastated, but as the specific memory of a city in emergency, of the specific quality of the fire's light in the sky, of walking through the ruins in the days after. He carried it the way you carry the major events of your young years, incompletely, selectively, in the specific fragment that was his experience rather than in the aggregate that was the fire. He was there. He remembered. He went back to work. Sleep. The fire is over. The city is rebuilt. The dome is there. The apprentices went back to work. The shoemaker made shoes in Clerkenwell. The vicar served the new church. The waterman charged a fair price. The woman retrieved her parmesan from the garden. The gold came out of the ground. The pigeons, the ones that survived, found new perches. The city is there. It is there right now at this hour while you sleep. The dome of St. Paul's lit against the London sky, the monument standing in the city, the site of the bakery with its small plaque, Pudding Lane still existing, still going to the river. The fire happened. The city survived. The survival is the story. The survival is always the story. Sleep. Good night. Let me give you the specific economics of the rebuilt city. Because the Great Fire's economic aftermath is one of the less discussed aspects of the disaster, and it shaped the subsequent development of London in ways that are still visible. The fire created a specific economic problem that had not previously existed in England, a mass casualty event of private property that required some mechanism for managing the loss. This problem produced, as a direct response, the first property insurance in England. Nicholas Barbin, a physician-turned-property developer who was one of the more remarkable figures of the Restoration period, established the Fire Office in 1680, the first fire insurance company in England. Within a few years, several competitors had appeared. The Great Fire created the insurance industry. Not immediately. The years between 1666 and 1680 were years without insurance, and the property losses of the fire were managed through the specific existing mechanisms of charity and credit and commercial relationship. But the fire created the specific demand for insurance that made the insurance industry viable. The insurance companies also created the fire brigades. The early insurance companies maintained their own fire brigades, teams of men with equipment who would respond to fires in properties insured by that company and attempt to save those properties. The firemen of these private brigades wore the specific badges of their company and would fight fires only in the buildings insured by their company. This was inefficient, but it was the beginning. The specific modern fire service that exists today, the public, professional, universal fire protection service, is the direct descendant of the private insurance company brigades that were created in response to the specific catastrophe of the Great Fire of London. The fire created the fire service. The fire that nobody could stop created the institution that stops fires. This is one of history's more satisfying ironies. Let me give you the specific experience of looking at the rebuilt city a decade after the fire. It is 1676. John Evelyn, who had walked through the ruins in September 1666 and grieved for the medieval city, is now walking through the rebuilt city. The specific character of what he sees: brick, the specific warm London brick, the brick made from the clay of the Thames Valley, the warm reddish-brown that characterizes the late 17th century London streetscape, replacing the white plaster and dark timber of the medieval city. Wider streets. Not much wider, the street widening of the rebuilding was modest, the competing property rights preventing the dramatic widening that the planners had hoped for, but wider. The new churches rising. Wren's churches had their own specific character. The classical spires and the geometric forms of the Restoration church architecture. That was different from the Gothic form of the medieval churches they replaced. Evelyn was not sure what he thought of the new churches. He respected Wren. He was not certain that classical architecture was the right form for an English city. He was also aware that the new city was better in specific practical ways. The wider streets, the brick construction, the specific improvements in urban form that the rebuilding had produced. He was of two minds. The medieval city he had loved was gone. The new city that had replaced it had its own merits. He walked through it. He was alive to both the loss and the replacement. This is the specific experience of watching a city rebuild, the specific mixture of grief for what was lost and recognition of what has been built in its place. The understanding that the replacement is not the same as the original. The understanding that the replacement is real. The new city was not the old city. The new city was London. And now truly the close. Thomas Farriner's Bakery. The east wind. The summer drought. The specific dry timber of the medieval city. The Lord Mayor's spectacular misjudgment. Samuel Pepys, woken by his maid at 3 in the morning. The pigeons. The woman with the parmesan. The men with the fire hooks. The king on horseback. St. Paul's burning, the lead running in the streets. The people on the river watching. The woman in the field, not knowing what to do. The gold in the wrong part of the garden. The fire stopping. The ruins. The rubble cleared. The surveyors mapping. The merchants writing letters. The Royal Exchange, rebuilt in 3 years. Wren designing the dome. The dome rising over 4 decades. The monument built 202 feet tall. William Carter making shoes in Clerkenwell. Thomas Cooper the waterman charging a fair price. The city there. The city here. The dome lit. The monument standing. The fire happened. The city survived. The survival is the story. Sleep. Good night. Let me give you one more look at what the rebuilt London was. Because by the 1680s and 1690s, London had become a different kind of city from the city that had burned. Not only different in its buildings, different in its character. The specific commercial energy that the rebuilding had channeled was, in the decades following the fire, also channeling itself into other projects. The coffee houses. The specific institution of the London coffee house. The places where merchants and traders and writers and scientists gathered, where information was exchanged and deals were made, and the specific intellectual life of the Restoration period was conducted, expanded dramatically in the decades after the fire. The coffeehouse culture of late 17th century London is one of the more distinctive features of the period. Lloyd's of London, the insurance market, began in Lloyd's Coffee House. The London Stock Exchange has its origins in Jonathan's Coffee House. The Royal Society, the scientific organization of which both Wren and Hooke were members, met in coffee houses. The fire that had burned the city had been followed by a rebuilding that produced not just new buildings, but a new urban culture. The brick streets and the coffee houses, and the insurance companies and the fire brigades, all of it arising from the specific catastrophe of September 1666. The fire created the modern city, not only through the buildings that Wren designed, through the specific institutional and cultural responses to the fire that the city developed in the decades after. The city that burned was the medieval city. The city that was built in its place was the modern city, the commercial, institutionally sophisticated, coffee-drinking city that became the model for the financial and commercial capitals of the following centuries. The fire was a catastrophe. The catastrophe produced the modern London. The modern London produced the modern world, or significant parts of it. The fire in the bakery, the dome on the skyline, the insurance industry, the fire service, the coffee houses, the bank, all of it following from a poorly managed oven on Pudding Lane in the driest summer anyone could remember. This is history. This is how it works. Sleep. The dome is lit. The coffee houses are closed at this hour. The insurance companies are processing claims. The fire service is on call. Good night. Let me give you the specific fire that started the insurance industry. Because we touched on Nicholas Barbin and the fire office, but the specific story of how the fire created insurance is worth telling in more detail. Nicholas Barbin was born approximately 1640, the son of the famously named Praise God Barbin, the leather seller and religious figure whose name became attached to the Parliament of 1653. Nicholas Barbin trained as a physician, found the practice of medicine less interesting than the practice of property development, and threw himself into the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire with the specific energy of someone who had identified a large commercial opportunity. He became a developer. He purchased burned properties in the city and rebuilt them, not waiting for the rebuilding regulations to fully settle, not waiting for the legal complexities of property rights in the ruins to be fully resolved, but moving quickly, acquiring and building. And then he identified the specific gap in the market that the fire had revealed. Property owners needed protection against fire. Not just the physical protection of better building materials, the brick and stone that the rebuilding regulations required, the financial protection of knowing that if the building burned, you would receive compensation. The fire office, which Barbin established in 1680, offered this: a premium paid annually, a compensation paid in the event of fire. The specific idea was not complicated. It was entirely new. There had been no fire insurance before. The Great Fire of London had created the specific demand for fire insurance by demonstrating, comprehensively, and with 13,200 burned houses, what the absence of insurance cost. Barbin identified the demand. He established the supply. The insurance industry was born. Within decades, there were multiple competing insurance companies. The insurance office for houses, the friendly society, the hand-in-hand, the Sun Fire Office. The specific competitive market for fire insurance that developed in late 17th century London was the beginning of an industry that now covers every imaginable risk in every country in the world. All of it tracing back to Thomas Farriner's oven. And now I will stop adding to this and let you sleep. You have been with London tonight for the full duration. From the bakery at 3 in the morning, to the rebuilt city 10 years later, to the coffee houses and the insurance companies and the dome on the skyline. The fire was a catastrophe. The catastrophe was also a creation. The medieval city became the modern city. The specific human beings who lived through it, who buried their parmesan and their gold, who charged fair prices and exploitative ones, who stood on the river watching and who walked through the ruins afterward, who rebuilt the exchange before the cathedral, because they knew what London was for. These people built the city that still exists. They built it from the ash of the city they had known. They built it quickly. They built it in brick. They built a dome on it. The dome is still there. Sleep. Good night. One final thing. Let me give you the specific quality of London at night today as you try to sleep. The dome of St. Paul's is lit. It has been lit since the specific decision was made to light it, the exterior lighting that makes the dome visible at night across the city. The specific warm gold of the dome's lighting, visible from many parts of London, is one of the signature visual elements of the London night. When Wren designed the dome, he did not design it for lighting. He designed it for the day, the specific way that stone catches daylight, the way that the dome's curve would be visible against the London sky from different angles and distances. The lighting is a modern addition. But the dome that is lit tonight is Wren's dome. Built because the medieval cathedral burned. Standing because Wren designed it, and because it was built over 44 years by the specific labor of the craftsmen who were building the rebuilt London. The specific connection between Thomas Farriner's oven on Pudding Lane in 1666 and the dome that is lit right now runs through. The fire, the ruins, the rebuilding regulations, the appointment of Wren, the design, the 44 years of construction, the completion in 1710, the 3.5 centuries of standing. That chain of causation ends, right now, in the dome you can see if you are in London tonight. And if you are not in London tonight, if you are somewhere else, listening to this, the chain of causation ends in the city you are in, which has been shaped in ways you may not fully see by the specific economic and institutional innovations that the fire created. The insurance industry, the fire service, the joint stock company, the specific modern financial institutions that emerged from the Restoration London that the fire's rebuilding created. The fire happened. The world we live in was built partly in response to it. The dome is lit. Sleep. Good night. Let me give you the specific Thames in the days after the fire. Because the Thames, the river that had been London's primary transportation artery for centuries, was a specific witness to the fire and to its aftermath, and its specific role in both the disaster and the recovery is worth dwelling on. During the fire, crowded with boats as we have described, the specific refugee fleet, the goods piled on the decks, the families in the boats watching the northern bank burn. In the days after, different. The Thames in the week after the fire was the specific place where the commercial activity that the city's burned warehouses could no longer accommodate was happening. Goods that had been stored in warehouses were now stored on boats. Boats that had been delivering goods to the city's burned wharves were now moored in midstream, their cargo unable to be unloaded because the wharves were ruins. The Thames was He warehouse, and the Thames was also the primary supply route for the food and materials that the rebuilding required. The brick arriving from the Thames Valley kilns by barge, the timber arriving by water from the forests of the south and east. The river that had carried the fire's refugees now carried the rebuilding's materials. The same river, different cargo. And now I truly stop. You have been with London for its best and worst night. The worst, the fire, the 4 days of burning, the 13,200 houses, the 87 churches, the lead from St. Paul's running in the streets. The best, what came after, the specific practical intelligence of the people who rebuilt, the waterman who charged a fair price, the shoemaker who took his tools, the merchant who wrote letters, the architect who designed the dome, the developer who invented insurance. These are Londoners. The specific character that the city developed over centuries, the commercial energy, the practical intelligence, the specific combination of civic grief and immediate reconstruction, these are visible in the fire and in the rebuilding. The fire happened. The city survived. The city is still there. Sleep. The dome is lit. Good night.